Of all the post-Gladiator sword and sandal epics that live in Gladiator's shadow, 2004's Troy has faded the least from memory. Adapted from a famous story, and its ambitious production hitting one of the highest budgets ever at the time of over $175 million, almost double what Gladiator cost to make, Troy may have gotten the closest to recreating the scale of the Hollywood Golden Age epics. Stuck between being faithful to an important piece of literature and the expectations of a modern Hollywood blockbuster, it has always occupied an awkward middle ground. Not quite mainstream enough to be an often revisited action flick, but not sophisticated enough to satisfy film buffs or enthusiasts of Greek mythology, and yet the years have been kind to Troy. Although not quite universally celebrated as a good film, its gradual positive reassessment says a lot about the frustrating state contemporary blockbusters have been in for quite a while. Whereas audiences have grown bored of artificial spectacles and franchises, many of these high production value films from the 2000s that may have been dismissed on release have become admired for their ambitious filmmaking craftsmanship that manages to create memorable, believable moments of spectacle in the transition period between practical effects and computer-generated effects, benefiting from the corners cut by their successors, especially on scales as large as Troy's, with huge set pieces and crowds of extras, amplified by CGI, but not relying on it to an extent it detracts from the spectacle and renders itself a waste of money. It's been receiving another wave of reassessment recently in the lead up to Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, which could be considered a sort of sequel to Troy. The Iliad centered on Achilles, portrayed by Brad Pitt in Troy, and The Odyssey centered on Odysseus, played by Matt Damon in Nolan's adaptation and by Sean Bean in Troy, where his narration opens and closes the film.
If they ever tell my story, let them say I walked with giants.
A major weakness Troy already reveals in its opening scenes is the typical blockbuster oversimplification of the source material. It's not that the script does a terrible job at being a mediocre Hollywood version of Greek mythology, that is, but even if you're not bothered about it straying a bit from the source material to align with mainstream audience tastes, or you're not bothered about it straying from real history, and even in the over 3-hour-long director's cut, the characters don't feel like they dive deep enough to become as interesting as they are given room to. A lot of the dialogue in these opening scenes, for instance, spoon-feed each character's basic traits and relationships like it's going down a checklist of narrative setups needed to set the rest of the film on a comfortably predictable path.
Achilles. I'll remember the name.
Achilles is obsessed with his name being immortalized in history, but he doesn't like fighting for Agamemnon, the most powerful of the kings, eventual commander of the combined Greek forces, and total arsehole. Agamemnon likewise dislikes relying on Achilles to boost the Greeks' morale in battle. Hector, the eldest prince of Troy, wants to make peace with Agamemnon's brother, Menelaus. Along with being highly respected, responsible, and honorable, Hector is considered one of the best warriors in the world, perhaps second only to Achilles, who is basically just on another level from everyone else.
Yeah, I've seen too many of my men struck down with his arm. Never again, I hope.
Menelaus is almost as much of an asshole as his brother, but noticeably dumber, and he dishonors his wife Helen by flirting with servants in front of everyone, so she seeks comfort from the younger prince of Troy, Paris, who is unlucky enough to fall in love with the most beautiful woman in the world. And there's some other supporting people in there as well, some of who help move the plot along at key moments, like Odysseus or King Priam, whilst others barely graduate from set dressing.
You love all of Troy. That is the way I love Helen.
Orlando Bloom's performance as Paris is one of the most criticised aspects of Troy, and unfortunately for Bloom, it seems his performances go on to be some of the most criticised aspects in a lot of his films. Personally, I don't think he's a bad actor, but he was suffering a bit from instant oversaturation during the 2000s following his debut in Lord of the Rings, and he certainly doesn't have the acting chops for this kind of theatrical, mythical epic.
No more palaces for us, no more servants. We don't need any of that.
The issue isn't that he's miscast as Paris. In fact, he fits the young, delicately attractive, impulsive fool that was needed from the man whose intense affection for Helen dooms everyone. Bloom was challenged with being charming enough for us to believe Helen would be willing to abandon everything for him, likeable enough to understand why Troy, mostly his brother Hector, defends him, and also frustratingly impulsive and cowardly. To give Bloom some credit, he gets a lot of the way there with all of these, but not far enough with any of them. Or at least, he couldn't convey the blend he went with in a compelling way, struggling to suggest there's a deep conflict going on beneath the surface. Instead, he often just comes across as weak and passive, with one romantic spark of bravery to do the right thing when he challenges Menelaus to a duel, and to a lesser extent when he runs through Troy at the end and kills Achilles. The ending siege on Troy is, however, where Bloom's confused performance most clearly reveals how it is lacking. As he looks across the city burning to the ground, his expression remains strangely flat, like he were looking at nothing at all. And then his worst moment is this dismissal of Helen before he hands over a sacred sword to the guy who would go on to become one of the ancestors of Rome, continuing the legacy of Troy far away. A moment that is clearly meant to have a lot of emotional weight, where Paris instead seems annoyed by Helen pointing out that the city is lost, and returning in the hopes of saving King Priam is probably unwise.
The city is dead. They're burning it to the ground.
Casting Helen of Troy was considered the most difficult out of everyone, trying to satisfy the unattainable and subjective standard of the most beautiful woman in the world, that works a lot better as an abstract concept on paper than it does on screen. Anybody reasonable would agree that the unknown actress they went with, Diane Kruger, was a very sensible option. Conventionally attractive, without standout, unique features that might distract from her conventionality, more model-esque than the other actresses cast for the film, but without feeling modern and out of place, and through some combo of her looks and acting, able to convey a melancholic loneliness, resulting more from her reputation as the most beautiful woman than from whether that's actually true. If nothing else, it's perfectly believable that a young, womanizing prince like Paris would fall for her.
You're younger than I ever was.
Having said all that, and despite the director's concerns over whether any actress could live up to Helen, to the point of considering not featuring the character at all, the film makes surprisingly little effort to present her as this overwhelming centre of attraction in any room she walks into, aside from something like King Priam's complimentary observation that the rumours of her beauty were correct. We are largely expected to accept Helen's influence at face value of Diane Kruger being very pretty. Few, if any, moments use filmmaking to give her an otherworldly aura, and her first reveal isn't even a grand one. She is just sitting alone at a table during the peace party. It really isn't presented as a big deal that she and Paris have been hooking up under Menelaus' nose, and Menelaus himself isn't detestable enough to heighten Helen's desperation to escape the prison of their marriage. Then, when Troy's peace party are departing Sparta, Paris smuggles Helen aboard the ship off-screen, giving us no intense escape sequence, but seemingly they made little effort to hide the smuggling, seen together by a fisherman, and then she's just chilling below deck, meaning it was very likely Menelaus would find out who exactly Helen left with, and very likely he would do so before they could make it back to Troy. This stuff is all technically before the Iliad, but if they were going to include this kind of prelude, they should have committed a bit more to why and how Helen and Paris make this escape. The half-assed nature it's presented in the film undermines the stakes of the whole opening act and of their whole characters. They disappear from a royal feast to wrestle in bed, and then leave like they're going on an impromptu holiday, stumbling into a catastrophe they've neglected to even attempt to avoid, whilst the romance itself remains underdeveloped. Normally, the Greeks moving against Troy is motivated primarily by Helen's abduction, because of the obligations of her former suitors to uphold an oath sworn to protect her marriage with whoever amongst them she chose. That's what Odysseus came up with to keep the peace amongst those those who wouldn't be chosen to marry the most beautiful woman in the world. If one of them tried anything, like Paris went on to do, the rest would move against them, and therefore they were all discouraged from doing so, and Helen should remain safe. Or at least her marriage should remain safe.
Nothing unifies a people like a common enemy.
Troy instead switches this up to Agamemnon using Helen's abduction as a convenient excuse to expand his territory and consolidate power even more than he's already done. Rather than a collection of kingdoms bound together by an oath to protect Helen's marriage, the film presents the most powerful kingdom pursuing strategic interests under heroic falsehoods, and in so doing loses more of that mythical aura that should surround Helen and this whole Trojan conflict. The film doesn't develop an entirely new framework using the same character and location names, it just likes to remix stuff that wouldn't fit as easily into a Hollywood blockbuster framework or runtime. For instance, Menelaus originally survives the Trojan War and brings Helen back with him, but instead, Hector kills him to save Paris when he's losing during their duel, even though the outcome of the duel probably wouldn't have mattered anyway, since the audience, and possibly Hector, are under the impression that Agamemnon has come to invade Troy, not to retrieve Helen. Originally, it's actually the goddess Aphrodite who saves Paris from Menelaus, and witnessing his failure causes Helen to gradually fall out of love with him, although Helen's feelings for Paris are supposed to be more ambiguous, stemming from the earlier meddling of Aphrodite casting a spell over her. In line with Troy's modernization, however, giving Hector that role of saving Paris in place of a god does reveal that, in this interpretation, his loyalty to his family overrides his honor, and more broadly, that political disputes can quickly become contorted by genuine personal conflicts and emotions, since the dishonorable death of the Greek leader's brother enrages said Greek leader and gives the Greek army a further sense of justification for being there fighting this war. By the way, this mini-series that released a year earlier in 2003, called Helen of Troy, focuses on Helen's part of the Trojan War in much more detail and includes more of the mythology than Troy, although it doesn't necessarily do Helen's story better than Troy does Achilles' story, and it doesn't have remotely close to the same production values. I could only find it in low quality uploaded to YouTube, and this is what Achilles looks and acts like when he shows up to duel Hector.
Achilles fights for his own hollow pride. He honors nothing but his own image in the glass. He hungers only for glory. If you do not feed him, he will starve.
Die, Hector!
You can decide if you think it's worth watching.
My name will last through the ages. Your name is written in sand.
In order to get his strongest asset, Achilles, involved in the conflict, Agamemnon sends over his second strongest asset, Odysseus, to convince him. When Odysseus is summoned for this, he messes with the messengers a little bit, pretending not to be himself, and then quickly takes on the mission. But a huge part of his character introduction originally is that he feigns madness to avoid participating in the war, unwilling to leave his family, and only when his son is placed in harm's way does he drop the act. Kind of a big deal when you consider that the Odyssey is largely about Odysseus trying to get home after the war is over. Not that Troy is required to pair itself with the Odyssey, but still, in comparison, this and the rest of what Sean Bean is given the room to convey in his performance is just a surface level imitation of the character's true intelligence and cunning.
This war will never be forgotten, nor will the heroes who fight in it.
He attempts to persuade Achilles by promising him the eternal glory he desires, but the film makes a major change to how much effort Achilles goes to avoid the war as well. Here, he visits his mystical mother, and she prophesies that, whilst he will find that eternal glory in Troy, he also won't return home. That's fine by him, so off he goes. His only reason not to join the war was because he dislikes working for Agamemnon. Originally, however, it was much more significantly established that Achilles Achilles is considered invulnerable not just because he's the best warrior in the world, but because of the magical shenanigans of his mother dipping him in a magical river as a baby. To avoid her son's death, she disguises him as a woman and shelters him amongst a secluded bunch of other women, and Odysseus uncovers this disguise by tricking him into demonstrating his fighting instincts. Maybe it was inevitable these backstories were streamlined to fit into a blockbuster movie, 3 hours long as that movie may be, but the package of their simplification through the film tosses away a lot of the mythological profundity, and I can't help but think the film would have really benefited from being 4 to 5 hours long.
Immortality! Take it! It's yours!
When the enormous Greek fleet arrives on the shores of Troy, Achilles makes sure he's the first to set foot on the battlefield, pushing to take the beach in front of everyone before Troy can react. A larger-than-life hero taking shortcuts with insane feats that shouldn't even be possible or nobody else would attempt, fits his pursuit of immortal glory and earns him the reputation for boosting the Greeks' morale, even if it still ends up feeling very Hollywoodized watching American action man Brad Pitt transplanted into the Bronze Age. So much so that the sudden bursts of graphic violence are quite jarring. Their attack on a temple of Apollo is one of the film's few acknowledgements of the gods. Whereas they are a constant presence in the source material, their divine influence is almost completely absent from Troy, conveyed only through some characters' beliefs rather than the gods explicitly intervening in their lives. But Achilles dismissing any fear of Apollo's wrath by decapitating his statue might not be a complete rejection of the story's supernatural elements. I could view this as just another thing that doesn't get in the way of his ambition as the fates continue to align to prevent him being injured or killed at the wrong moment, such as this arrow he didn't see coming that lands in his shield the moment he straps it across his back. Hector and his party arrive already too late to save the temple, and Hector would have died right then and there if he didn't find himself face to face with Achilles, who, rather than killing Troy's greatest and most respected warrior, spares him with the line,
It's too early in the day for killing princes.
obviously demonstrating his supreme confidence to win a future and much more meaningful showdown, but possibly holding some vague sense of a moral compass, such as that killing a prince outside a temple would be too bold even for him.
In 1,000 years, the dust from our bones will be gone.
Yes, Prince. But our names will remain.
Unfortunately, it's hard to rummage through Brad Pitt's wildly inconsistent performance. Physically, he has no problem satisfying the role of an unmatched combatant, but at no point do I feel like he really embodies the gravitas such a mythical force of nature should move through the world with, like the very narrative itself is parting in his wake. It's unsurprising that, in the years following the release, Pitt expressed dissatisfaction with the whole production, stuck between wanting to give a subtle performance and being posed as the action star leading the poster, whilst taking the role out of a contractual obligation to begin with.
I'll have her give me a bath. And then, who knows?
You sack of wine!
After the Greek army has stationed themselves along the beach, Achilles clashes with Agamemnon over Briseis, who was captured from the temple. She was supposed to be Achilles' spoils of war, and Agamemnon taking her for himself was therefore deeply disrespectful, and it is through her that the middle of the film attempts to develop Achilles away from a simple, glory-seeking warrior, a more introspective and morally conflicted hero who is willing to protect a captive woman.
I thought you were a dumb brute.
Through their basic, uninteresting, and questionable romance, Achilles has a change of heart about seeking glory in this war at all.
Going home.
Odysseus fails to reignite his motivation, and Achilles only returns to the conflict for a brief spout of revenge after the death of his cousin Patroclus, who had been following Achilles around without being allowed to fight. The setup of this death is that Troy, emboldened by their recent success during the Greek army's first attack, makes the idiotic decision to leave the defensive advantage of their walls and meet the Greek army on the beach. Hector leads the assault, even though he was the only voice of reason amongst Troy's council, and they appear to be winning until Achilles makes a surprise appearance to come and save the day. He and Hector have a showdown that everybody stops to watch. In their view, it's humanity's two greatest warriors dueling to the death, and this moment could determine who wins the war, because one mythological thing this film does get right is that the presence of a single man can turn the tides of battle. However, upon Hector brutally slashing the throat of Achilles, everybody finds out this was not Achilles all along. Whilst Achilles remained uninterested in his tent, still intending to set sail home, his cousin Patroclus posed as the Greek hero in his armour and marched into battle, and now he's dead.
In all my years to come, may my heart never turn as black as yours!
It must be said that, though it's obvious what it's going for, the honourable and compassionate Hector's regret over killing this young man, and everyone dreading the consequences once Achilles finds out, this moment doesn't land nearly as well as it would have done were Patroclus properly promoted as such an important person to Achilles. Whilst the Iliad doesn't explicitly describe Achilles and Patroclus as lovers, it is often interpreted that they were, and regardless of whether their bond was romantic, that kind of emotional depth and importance is what's needed to push Achilles over the edge of being consumed by vengeance.
Hector!
In hindsight, it is perhaps amusing that Troy was written by David Benioff of Game of Thrones fame and infamy. Troy shows signs that, from the start of his career, Benioff may fare better interpreting great source material than he does replacing above a certain amount of it.
Let us pledge that the winner will allow the loser all the proper funeral rituals.
There are no pacts between lions and men.
The duel between Achilles and Hector is the scene everybody remembers from Troy, likely including people who haven't even seen the whole film. It's one of the better choreographed sword fights put to film, supported by the mythic grandeur of the rivalry between these two characters who might otherwise have made good training buddies, making for more of an action climax to the story than the siege of Troy that follows. Much like the duel between Paris and Menelaus, the outcome of this deeply personal confrontation may strongly influence the outcome of the war, even if neither side is under the impression that it is an attempt to do so. Hector takes one side as the honourable, intelligent, and loving moral centre of the story, simultaneously willing to save Paris from losing his duel and face certain death against an unbeatable opponent. This might resemble the legendary showdown he was looking for during their first meeting outside the temple, but wrathful grief has overtaken whatever pride, ambition, or respect was previously motivating Achilles. Once the fight begins, Brad Pitt's physical performance is what sells the myth of Achilles better than anything else, moving unlike anyone else in the whole film, and unlike how you might expect anyone to fight from a relatively grounded portrayal of Greek mythology as this. Whereas earlier action scenes were a disorienting mess of choppy editing and shaky camera work, this whole duel makes sure to match the precision of Achilles' every move, his sword swishing through the air with perfect rhythm, every bodily motion seamlessly flowing into the next, and each strike emphasized by an unnaturally strong impact. Achilles does not simply win every encounter because he is stronger, more skilled, or literally immortal. It is because he fights in ways impossible to replicate or anticipate, like he's making up entire new techniques on the fly through nothing but his own genius intuition. The combat may be fueled by cinematic fantasy rather than historical accuracy, but embracing the magnitude of such an event is the exact kind of thing this story needs, and it's more important that the unrealistically elaborate swordplay communicates each character's personality and emotions. When Achilles ultimately slays Hector and drags his body around behind his chariot, the film preserves one of the Iliad's most disturbing moments, and the meeting between Achilles and King Priam continues that faithfulness. Peter O'Toole's classically trained gravitas quite effectively overwhelming the limits of Brad Pitt's performance, perhaps unintentionally making Achilles seem for the first time very small and insignificant.
You're still my enemy tonight. But even enemies can show respect.
Achilles having this reconciliation with his humanity and the funeral for Hector may be the Iliad's emotional conclusion, but a blockbuster movie about the Trojan War couldn't go without its most iconic set piece, and couldn't go without showing its cinematically reshuffled version of how the phrase Achilles' heel would to this day refer to a subject's single fatal weakness. Odysseus somewhat unremarkably conceives of the Trojan horse idea upon seeing a horse carving in their camp. But in the film's favour, once the giant wooden offering has been constructed, it's clear that translating such mythological imagery to real life makes each side seem strategically old-fashioned and foolish. The Greeks for thinking such an obvious trap would work, and Troy for actually wheeling this obvious trap into their walls. The reasoning to do so comes back to those pesky gods the film otherwise likes to ignore the existence of.
We shall take it to the temple of Poseidon.
I think we should burn it.
Burn it, my prince. It's a gift to the gods.
The head priest continuing his awful streak of advice by arguing against Paris, who takes his brother's place as the voice of reason. Since viewers are so likely to be familiar with the Trojan horse plan, there's an odd and uncomfortable dynamic watching them build it here that contributes to the tragedy of Troy's destruction, where we are watching the side that has emerged as the more sympathetic of the two get tricked into causing their own demise by one of the only likeable characters from the less sympathetic side. Whilst Odysseus proves himself one of the Greek army's most valuable assets by doing this, Achilles spends the slaughter running through Troy looking for his shallow romantic interest. By this point, or from the point he was ready to sail home, he has begun to value love and peace over the murdering that came with his glory seeking. But in a contrived turn of events, he allowed Briseis to return to Troy with King Priam, endangering her to the city's attack. I suppose he didn't expect anyone to come up with a plan that would so easily allow them to bypass the impenetrable walls. Fortunately, on his way through the city, he manages to find Briseis just as she is stabbing Agamemnon through the neck, saving her from the meagre 2 guards who were accompanying the Greek commander, rather than giving us a more substantial final action scene where he faces down a whole room of elite soldiers. And then only during that commotion could Paris arrive to land the famous shot whilst Achilles is distracted. Paris and Briseis leave just in time to avoid a whole crowd of soldiers showing up to gawk at Achilles laying dead from an arrow in the heel. Odysseus honours Achilles' dead body and narrates the end of the movie as Troy's few survivors walk to start their new lives. All in all, quite a somber ending for such a high-budget blockbuster, and I will commend the film for that. In the end, Troy is neither a faithful adaptation of Homer nor a complete failure as a historical epic, occupying a space that is more than a dumb, switch-your-brain-off blockbuster, but less than a confident, Hollywood-flavoured vision of this mythology. Its appeal to mainstream audiences coming at the expense of fulfilling its full potential. The impressiveness of its practical production and its memorable cast who were willing to take the material seriously have given the film a small place in pop culture that enlarges with every year these epic movies feel less likely to get made again. And I guess we'll have to wait and see if Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey turns out to be the same kind of trendsetter Gladiator was back then.